Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with how to plant your own culinary herb garden. That's right, I've been successfully growing my own herbs for decades without really actually knowing what I was doing. But despite that, I've always had very good results, so I thought the timing might be right to share this information with you. And not only is growing your herbs a fun hobby, but just think of the luxury of not having to go out and buy a whole bunch of herb just because you need a tablespoon for a recipe. So it really is also an incredible convenience. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started. And first up, I'm going to go over the herbs I think you should be planting. And we'll start off with one of my favorites and most commonly used culinary herbs, thyme. And I'm going to do 3 of my personal favorites. We have some English thyme, some French thyme, and some lemon thyme. It's an incredibly fragrant and delicious variety that's just absolutely perfect with seafood. And then I definitely think you should also plant some chives, which I find grow very easily. And they just have that beautiful, sweet, subtle, oniony flavor. Even people that don't like onions like chives. So we'll do a couple chive plants. And we're definitely also going to want some Italian parsley, which when it's small like this, and blowing in the wind, and out of focus, looks exactly like cilantro. But it isn't. That's just what young Italian parsley looks like. So we'll do a couple of those. I'm also really hoping you plant some sage, which is very hardy, and when it grows up, a very attractive plant. And the real benefit of having this stuff in your backyard is you can just toss a couple of those leaves into the frying pan the next time you're making pork chops and end up with something significantly more delicious with virtually zero effort and no additional cost. So I definitely think we want to do some sage. And then next up we have a couple of oregano plants. I'm going to do some Greek oregano, as well as the equally delicious and just as beautiful Italian oregano. And yes, the different varieties do have a little bit of a subtle flavor difference. But even if they didn't, they both have a little different look, which is going to add to the visual diversity of our herb garden. And then, of course, we need some rosemary. And what you want to look for, in my opinion, is a variety called Tuscan blue rosemary, which I think works out the best in the kitchen. And like pretty much everything else I've showed you so far, incredibly easy to grow. And then speaking of Italian herbs, of course, we're going to have some basil. When it comes to a culinary herb garden, this is pretty much mandatory. And one tip, I like to get the largest, most established plant I can find. And what you want to look for is something called Genovese or sweet basil, which would be the variety you're currently paying too much for at the store. And then last but not least, we also want to do some mint. And spearmint would be your classic culinary mint. And while there's dozens more of herbs we could plant, for me these are the must-haves, and they also happen to be the most commonly used and easiest to grow. Speaking of which, let me show you how to plant these. So first thing here, if you're going to reuse a pot, which I am, we want to knock out or rinse out all the old dirt. We don't want any mystery plants popping up. And then, because herbs really like good drainage, we'll place some rocks or broken up pottery at the bottom of the pot. And by the way, that broken piece I put over the hole was hard to see, but it actually had a curve to it. So I'm not trying to plug that hole, I'm actually doing the opposite. By placing those pieces of broken pottery and rocks at the bottom, that's going to help things drain after waterings. Plants in general, and herbs in particular, like to live in well-drained soil. And then once that's in, we will add our dirt, otherwise known as potting soil or planting mix. So what I have is a ready-to-use planting mix, which is basically potting soil with some other stuff added in to help it retain moisture. And how much dirt we put in is going to depend on the size of the plant, obviously. So for me, for this parsley, that looks like enough. So once our soil's in, we'll dig a little hole with our hand. We'll remove our herb from the container, and we will check to make sure it's not root-bound. And this one was not bad, but what you generally want to do is kind of tear apart the bottom of that root system, just kind of split it open like that, before placing it in, and that's going to help those roots start to spread out. And by the way, the reason I'm crowding this pot with 2 parsley plants is because that's going to produce a smaller plant with more leaves. Yes, if it just used one, it would grow into a bigger, stronger plant, but that's not what I want. All right, how much parsley are we going to use? So I'm intentionally looking for something that's a little stunted. And then once our plants are in, all we're going to do is take some extra soil and add that around our plants. And we just want to add enough until it's up to the exact level as it was when it was in the container, which is what I have right here. And please note, while you do want to press down the soil a little bit to make sure your plants are secure, you don't want to use a lot of force and compress that soil too much. So you want to use a nice light touch. And then once that's done, we always want to give any newly planted plant a drink. So we'll give it a little bit of water. And that pot of parsley is ready to produce all summer and fall. And since I live in San Francisco, winter and spring. But anyway, we've successfully planted our parsley. And we'll go ahead and do the same exact thing with everything else. So I went ahead and I did my chives. And by the way, it's just not for the kitchen anymore. Once you fill these with dirt, don't be afraid to give them the old shake-a to kind of level everything off and see where you're at. And like I just said, we want that soil level to be exactly where it was when these were still in their containers, which is basically where the plant ends and the roots start. Okay, so we use the exact same technique to plant our chives, as we will to plant our basil, and besides making sure we have good drainage and a proper soil level, another critical thing to know when you're growing herbs is that you want to aggressively pinch them back, especially with something like basil. So what we'll do is we'll take the top 2 or 3 inches off each of these stems, and not only is that going to make for an amazing basil mayonnaise that I'm going to dip some asparagus in later, but that's actually going to signal to the plant to send out lots of new growth. Okay, so even if you don't have a recipe to use this stuff in, you still want to pinch back your herbs pretty regularly. So I'm going to do the same thing to this mint plant. All right, just pinch it off right there, right above where the next set of leaves start. And by doing that, instead of just having one skinny tall stalk, this mint plant will start growing outward. And we could continue on doing everything in its own container, but I'm actually going to do the rest of my herbs in one planter. So using the techniques you just saw, I already planted my rosemary and my sage, and I'll continue on with my oregano. And of course, if you are going to plant different varieties, you got to remember which is which. So sometimes I'll do a little saying in my head, like Italian in the front, Greek in the back, Italian in the front, Greek in the back. And I'll just use a little saying like that to help me remember. But of course, the easiest way is just to hide these little plastic labels somewhere near the plant. But anyway, I planted the oregano, as well as our 3 varieties of thyme. And if you're wondering why I grouped all these herbs in one planter, it's because unlike the ones we put in individual containers, all these herbs enjoy basically the same conditions. And in particular, how much they're watered, which by the way is not very much at all. So these more resinous herbs like your rosemary, thyme, and oregano, etc., we might only have to water these once a week, if that. And it depends on where you live, of course. I live in San Francisco where it hasn't rained in like 3 years, so it's obviously going to be different. And then once those are in, we'll give that a nice watering. And our fast, easy, and relatively inexpensive herb garden is done. And so easy to maintain. As long as these herbs get some sun and a little bit of water, there's really nothing to do but enjoy them. And if you're wondering about fertilizer, stop wondering. Herbs do not need fertilizer. In fact, in general, they like lean growing conditions. A lot of people think that the flavor of these herbs is much better if they're actually a little bit distressed. So other than the basil that likes a good amount of moisture, the rest of the stuff we just need to water it enough to keep it alive. But anyway, that's it. I rounded out my herbscaping with a couple previously potted oregano plants. And at this point, there's really nothing left to do but enjoy. And by enjoy, I mean go out and trim the tops once in a while, followed shortly thereafter by cooking with said trimmings. So if you'll excuse me, I'm going to head in to make some pizza sauce. And as I do, I hope you head to the nursery to get your culinary herb garden started soon. So I really do hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all, well, there's no ingredients, but there will be a ton more information as usual. And as always, enjoy.